I've entitled this sermon, Sound Mind and the Spirit, so I want to start with this. Have you ever met somebody who is crazy? I mean, it's really, I know we laugh at that, and I understand our laughter, but if you've ever dealt with a person whose mind is gone, it is so tragic. It is so sad. Because the inability to reach them with reality, even physical reality, let alone to say the things that are spiritual, it is just beyond that grasp for them. I'm giving this sermon because I think it's important for us as Christians in the world in which we live. And this is the only world in which you and I have to live, and we experience things and we see things going on around us that can affect a sound mind. And we can have a sound mind from a physical point of view, and that may appear to be adequate in the moment, but the reality of a sound mind has to have, and the Scriptures show us, and that's what I want to go through today, has to have another element for us to really be sound-minded, and that is to have the Spirit of God. And the results of not having that are not only detrimental, they're devilish and they're deadly for us. So the Apostle Paul tells us in the book of Romans, when he was writing to the church there at Rome, and it's amazing how that people think, how all of us think and can think, and how that we can respond to certain things. But he tells us here in Romans chapter 8, and beginning here in verse 5, those who live according to the sinful nature have their minds set on what nature desires. But those who live in accordance to the spirits have their minds set on spiritual desires. The mind of sinful men is death, but the mind controlled by the Spirit is life and peace. So these are the major contrasts that we find here, and the way that the King James puts it, to be carnally minded is death, to be spiritually minded is life and peace. And the one way of using our mind, again, leads to death, the other leads to life and peace. And we live in a world today that is battling for our minds. And I think that we see that in ISIS, the Islamic things. The people are battling for the minds of people. In one way or another, they want to control the mind. But that is one of the evils, real evils that we see. But it doesn't stop there. All the time, people are battling for our minds in one way or another. They want us to see things from a certain perspective. There are worlds of different ideologies, for example. If you're Chinese, your government is trying to get you to see something from the communist point of view. If you're a socialist, people are trying to get you to see it from that particular kind of view. If you're a Republican, people are trying to get you to see it that way. If you're a Democrat, they're trying to get you to see it that way. If you're black, you're trying to get it to see the black way. If you're white, you're trying to get it to see these different ways. And we have all these different ideologies, and each side taking themselves to be right. Each one of them very, very convinced in their own mind that they are right. And we also see in these ideologies that on the one hand you love one and you hate the other. We see that happening all the time in the world in which we live, and then we see the extreme of it again when people really are wicked and evil and they're trying to spread their form of thinking. Then we also have the physical battles, and that battles the spiritual. That mankind is capable, in our minds, we're capable of making up our own mind. We use our minds. And interestingly enough, in the book of Numbers, it concludes that everyone with Israel back then was doing that which was right in their own eyes. And so we're pretty well convinced of that. I mention oftentimes to clients when I'm talking to them and doing mental health counseling with them that one of the things that you have to be careful of, and I use, to me, it's a very descriptive kind of metaphor, when we just leave ourselves to our own way of thinking, I call it mental incest. that is the inbreeding of your own ideas. Now, in our Christian life, though, sometimes we can find ourselves alone, isolated, and then we get to thinking things. And we begin, it's amazing the things that we can think. But we also have to realize that even in our own thinking, that we are influenced by different things. And for a Christian, we recognize that sometimes our influence can be spiritual, but not good spiritual. It can be other spirits that influence. The devil has his day where he influences us. We think things and we think, wow, why was I ever thinking that? Or how did I come to think that? And so when we think about our own physical mind, which is oftentimes something that we don't think about. I mean, how often you go around thinking, I'm going to think about my brain today. I'm going to think about what's going on in my brain. Those little synapses are firing and they're doing this and that. This is the most mysterious thing of mankind, the brain and how it works and what's going on within the brain. So it's more than, when we think about the brain, it's more than just physical, because of the way in which it works. And everyone has, as I mentioned, being right in their own mind. Now, notice also what the Apostle Paul has to tell them later on in the very next verse. When he tells them here about these differences, he tells them here in beginning in verse 7 here, the sinful mind is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those controlled by the sinful nature cannot please God. Now, you see how problematic this suddenly becomes? It becomes very, very problematic in that it's telling us that the carnal mind, and this is what the King James, hates God. And so when we think about our mind and how it works, and we think about the carnal way in which we live, we recognize that it is a difficulty. And this is one of the difficulties in our way of thinking and our having a sound mind. We live in a world today that does not love God, the majority of mankind. Now, when we say God, and who is the Apostle Paul talking about? He isn't talking about God in the broad expanses that our world today has. Because we have a world today that uses the term God all the time. But what Paul is referring to is the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Jacob, the God who is the Father of our Lord Jesus. That is who he has a reference to. And he says mankind hates God because of in that carnal nature. And that mankind can't and won't be subject to God. And when we think about being subject to God, we're thinking about allowing God to work in our lives, allowing God to be in our lives, letting God direct us, because we think about subject. And it's a problem with our human nature. We don't want anybody, when we think about subject, to be subject to someone, be under their authority, and to tell us what to do and what is right and good and righteous and holy, as opposed to that which is not. So as human beings, though, we're all blessed. When we think about the human mind, we're all blessed above all creatures because we do have a mind. And the human mind allows us to do incredibly great things. So, and this can be the illusion sometimes because we do incredible great things. And when we look at the book of Genesis, for example, and the creation of mankind, the account there, everything that God had created in the garden was incredibly, wonderfully great. All that creation. And you can think that you got it all. That everything that you need. But we realize in that particular example, Satan encouraged them to get something they didn't need. But though they thought they needed it so that they would have more understanding. Our mind is able to think. And we can think in the past, we can think in the present, and we can think in the future.
Feeling the blues today, or tired of life already? Do you have questions about life, or need spiritual advice. The Worldwide Church of God is located in Fairfield, Santa Rosa, and Modesto, California. We welcome everyone to attend our worship services with us every week at the times listed on your screen.